Welcome to Insatiable, the podcast where we discuss the intersection of food, psychology, and culture. I'm your host, Ali Shapiro, an integrated health coach, 32-year and counting cancer survivor, and have radically healed my relationship with food and my body. And for the past 17 years, I've been working with clients individually, in group programs, and in company settings to do the same. Welcome. The information in this podcast should not be considered personal, individual, or medical advice. Hello, Insatiable listeners. Today we have a special rebroadcast from my episode with Dr. Vora around sugar's role in anxiety. And since we originally had this episode, the conversation around anxiety and mental health is beginning to really evolve and change. I know a lot of you listen to We Can Do Hard Things, and Glennon Doyle has shared how she no longer believes after, 20 some years, maybe 30, I forget the exact number, that she no longer has an anxiety disorder. I see slowly the mental health conversation changing. So I wanted to rebroadcast this as we had done this episode a couple of years ago. And I think it is actually still a more forward understanding of some of the physical aspects of anxiety. And I reached out to Dr. Vora, Ellen, to see if her perspective on anxiety has changed since we did this episode and since her book has come out. And she said back to me, and I'm paraphrasing, that yes, her perspective on anxiety has evolved. And the clearest way she knows how to articulate it is that we tend to believe that anxiety is genetic, a destined chemical imbalance, okay? And she does not believe that. She said that anxiety is communicating an imbalance and it has root causes. She said it could be physical root causes like deregulated blood sugar, hormone imbalances, chronic sleep deprivation. And she also added that she thinks it can have a psycho-spiritual dimension. She said that could include unresolved trauma, maybe lack of community, and lack of meaning and purpose. So to her, anxiety isn't about a destiny. It's something that we can always address the root causes of. So that's her evolved understanding. And we're going to get into the nitty gritty, especially around the physical causes of anxiety in today's rebroadcast. Enjoy it. And we will link to her book in the show notes. And if you're curious too about how to get started with your blood sugar, I will link to my breakfast experiment, which can help you start to understand how blood sugar can create your own anxiety or an absence of anxiety in your own life. All right, enjoy today's show. Ellen Vora, MD, graduated from Columbia University Medical School, received her BA in English from Yale University, and is a board-certified psychiatrist, medical acupuncturist, and yoga teacher. Dr. Vora takes a functional medicine approach to mental health, considering the whole person and addressing imbalance at the root, rather than reflexively prescribing medication. In addition to her private practice, Dr. Vora is also a writer, speaker, and a consultant for 2 healthcare startups. Thank you so much for being here today.
Ali, it is so my pleasure. Thank you.
As I was getting ready for this interview, I was listening to some of your past interviews and learned that you watched In Living Color growing up. And
yeah,
I did too and loved it. And I found out from my best friend growing up that she actually wasn't allowed to watch that show. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh my God, am I the only one who watched it? So I love that you were a fan of that show as well.
Yeah, it was kind of considered edgy at the time, which is crazy and was probably just racist.
Exactly. I was like, that was our family show on Sunday night.
Same. Yeah.
So before we get into discussing all your brilliance and your kind of rebel, edgy approach even to psychiatry, one of the themes that we talk on this show is how so much of weight struggles and food struggles is about a sense of belonging and finding where we can show up as ourselves in the world. And I find that it's really interesting that you have this edgier approach to psychiatry. So how did you come to this idea of a more holistic understanding and have that sense of self, or I guess discovering sense of self, that enabled you to pursue this much less road traveled approach to anxiety and mental health?
Yeah, I think it's funny. Every time I speak on a podcast, I always, I get a similar question and I always kind of fumble through an explanation. I think in a way I still haven't, maybe it's like the history is too fresh, but I still haven't fully made sense of why. I think what I usually say is that it was a crisis of, it was two parallel crises that I was in med school. One was that I really did not believe in what I was being taught. But then you can kind of go further and ask, like, why did I find myself skeptical when everybody around me was like eating it right up? But yeah, everything sat wrong with me. And I thought, well, here's an example. I was in the OR doing an appendectomy where you take out someone's appendix. And I asked the attending surgeon, I was like, so why do people get appendicitis? And he looked at me, and surgeons are always like these like tall, fit, handsome, kind of intimidating men often. And he was just like, we don't ask why.
Oh my God.
I was like, I am a Jewish psychiatrist. Like, all I do is ask why. Like, this is what I'm about. And so, like, it just felt wrong to me that a lot of medicine was like symptoms equal diagnosis equals medication, and there wasn't a whole lot of like, but why does it happen? How do we prevent it? And even when people discussed prevention, they were talking about like primary prevention by being on statins before you have a cardiovascular event. It was like,
like a colonoscopy is a prevention.
Totally. Yeah. Like it's still interventions. There's just nothing about like, does it matter how we sleep, how we eat, how our relationships are, whether or not we're estranged from nature. And so, it just always felt like a bad fit. But then there was a parallel crisis, which was that my own health was a disaster. And I was, a smart like doctor with resources, and you'd think, and I thought I was doing everything right, and yet everything was going wrong in my body. And so it was just a place where I was at a real, like, I can't keep moving forward the way I am. And so what do I do? And it was a very inefficient, let's call it like 10-year process of hoarding other trainings and figuring out how do I get myself well? How can I help my patients be well?
I love, though, I feel like I often say the obstacle is the path. And I love that even though it was inefficient, like you kept navigating because of that felt sense. Because I think, we often dismiss that way of knowing, right? Especially because it often can be, not that men don't have it, but intuition and a felt sense tends to be, women often come from that frame more than men. And I think men could too, if they were allowed to be more emotional in our culture. Yeah. But I love that you honored that way of knowing, because especially being a doctor, being in a heady, Columbia, Yale, like very intellectual sense of community, that can be challenging to trust that like, this just doesn't feel right. And I can't even name why.
Yeah, it is so uncomfortable to challenge that kind of ivory tower establishment. I think in a way I did a lot of like Oscar award-winning performances of acting. Like I learned how to talk the talk of like, how do you be one of these rigorous academic medicine bullies? And like I learned how to kind of fake it while I was there just to survive, not expose myself as a total Yahoo. But then once I've progressively broken free each phase of my life, and now I don't even try to use that voice anymore. I just speak totally my truth about health.
Well, and isn't that the medicine in and of itself, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Really finding our voice and being unapologetic, not in like an FU kind of way, but just, I don't need to prove anything. Like it is what it is. So yeah, I'm so glad you did that, because we're going to learn so much from you today. And also, I do think it helps for people, especially, you are such an integrated practitioner that I think you're helping people who might not normally trust this stuff be able to be open to it. So thank you for doing all of that academic work and acting for those of us who need people like you, because I'm someone who definitely does. So thank you. So we're going to talk about anxiety and sugar today, but first I want to define anxiety, because I feel like everybody is anxious today. And if everyone's anxious, what are we even talking about? And I loved in one time you called the DSM, which is, the clinical way that psychiatrists and psychologists diagnose people, as a brochure for big pharma. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh my God, that is such a brilliant visual. So how do you define anxiety, and is it normal? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I basically don't define it. If someone comes to me and they are subjectively experiencing anxiety, that they're identifying with anxiety, I will work with that. And if somebody comes to me and they aren't using the word anxiety and haven't really called themselves out on it, but they're demonstrating symptoms that I would say are consistent with some anxiety disorder, whether it's kind of an OCD tendency or an agoraphobic tendency or like a rumination way of thinking about things, I'm actually not going to put the label on them because it ends up being more of a self-fulfilling prophecy than anything helpful in the end. But it's not even that common anymore for anyone to like be like, I've had anxiety and I had no idea. Like people are just like very unanimously identifying with anxiety these days. So much more to me is actually, let's start at the starting place of, okay, you're anxious. Now what do we do with this? And I think that I'm writing a book on it right now, which is really helping me get clarity on how I think about it. And lately, my going hypothesis is breaking it down into true anxiety and false anxiety. And I think about false anxiety as all the ways our body gets tripped into a stress response unnecessarily. And that these are actually really preventable causes of anxiety, but they're really common. And it's things like excessive caffeine consumption, chronic sleep deprivation, the blood sugar crashes, micronutrient deficiencies, thyroid issues, gut issues, like it goes on and on. And it's kind of everything that the naturopaths and the functional medicine docs have been focusing on. And then I think that part of what happens when, like, I love, it's so well-meaning, and it's really what I'm about to kind of help people see, like, the way you're feeling, it doesn't have to be that way. There's a physical root cause. Let's fix it. I like that. But I also think that in some way it invalidates people who are struggling with anxiety. And I think that there really is true anxiety, that there's no amount of blood sugar stabilization or gut healing that's ever going to repair it. And it's actually somebody's deep truth. And to me, it's the people that are intuitive and sensitive and artists, and they are sensing something. And I think, we're recording this in the moment of coronavirus right now. Like, in certain senses, I feel like all of my anxiety patients are just like looking at the world and being like, told you so. They're like, I knew
I've been waiting for this. I've been waiting for this.
It's like I've had this sense of like existential dread all this time that some shit was about to go down. And here we are. So I think that there is like truth to anxiety sometimes. And in a way, rather than as a culture saying you're too sensitive or you should go on medication or you should talk to somebody about this, or even the more enlightened like functional doctor, like, ooh, could it be your thyroid? Are you deficient in B12? I think that sometimes it's like, oh, great sage, tell us what you're thinking. Like, tell us, like, we want to learn from you. You are our artist and you can be our guide.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much because, in my work, I definitely work on blood sugar and gut health with people just from mainly, getting people back to whole, real foods. But on that left, I guess on the real anxiety side, like I often find that people's stories and their unresolved trauma creates this felt sense, but they're also just, my clients tend to be very sensitive. They're in healthcare themselves. They're like literal rock stars. They are the artists of the world, or they're business leaders, right? It shows up in various capacities, but they are just sensitive. And if they can kind of resolve some of that unresolved trauma, then it can reduce the anxiety to a level that it's manageable and helpful. Because I don't think all anxiety is bad, right? It kind of keeps us on our toes.
I think what you just said is actually really profound, and it's got me scratching my head, because if there's anything that kind of bridges those two false and true anxieties, it's actually trauma. Because in certain sense, having a history of trauma, it's almost like that is a little bit of a false anxiety in that we can work on the trauma. Like, is that still a knot in your body, in your brain, that could use a little massaging, like could use EMDR or somatic experiencing therapy? Like, could we help you work through it so there isn't a blockage to the flow of energy? And in that respect, it's like an underlying cause of anxiety, and it can be false anxiety. But then there's definitely a truth to anxiety that's fueled by a history of trauma, which is more just like it set the pattern in your nervous system for how safe this world is and how much you can trust it. And I'm like this has me thinking in a very trippy way, but it's sort of like we also on some level need people. Trauma is real. It happened. And that should give us information about how safe the world is. So I think on some level, you don't want to completely let go of that because it does represent reality.
Yeah, yeah. I know, because what's normal isn't really normal, right? I mean, that's kind of I'm like, people who are like blissfully happy, they're the ones I'm like, wait a second, are they? Not that you have to read the news, all the time, but I mean, we are fundamentally on an unsustainable course, environmentally, emotionally, all that stuff. But that's for a different podcast. We'll have you back and talk more trippy stuff. But I love that, and breaking that down into false and real. And so we're going to talk today about one of the false anxieties, which is basically deregulated blood sugar and sugar. And I would love if you can explain how sugar biochemically creates anxiety in the body. Because I think people, again, think they're just anxious and they think maybe it's something outside of them, but there is something actually internally. And I would love for you to explain why the body feels anxious when we aren't eating the right foods for ourselves.
Yeah, it's a couple factors. To me, the primary, like the lion's share of it, is that when we consume refined carbohydrates or sugar, things that break down really quickly, and basically our digestive tract is good at breaking it down quickly, and then it absorbs quickly into our bloodstream. So we get a spike of blood sugar, and then our insulin says, whoa, can't have this much blood sugar, chases it, and then we have this compensatory kind of crash in blood sugar. That crash precipitates a stress response in our body. And this is like a good design. Basically, it's, part of what motivates us to seek food, but it's just the way the body works, that if we have low blood sugar, the way that our body kind of starts this series of checks and balances to correct that is with a stress response. It secretes adrenaline, it secretes cortisol, that communicates to the liver to break down stored glycogen, and then it releases glucose into the bloodstream, and we have blood sugar again. And it kind of saves the day, which is great, but it leaves us like shaking and anxious and panicked and feeling like, it's a 5-alarm fire. And so, like, to summarize that more clearly, like when we eat sugary things, we have a spike in blood sugar, then a crash in blood sugar, and that crash is a stress response. And the stress response feels synonymous with anxiety. And so that's the main reason. And I find like I'm not a very big, at this point in my life, I don't typically eat too much sugar. And when I do, I always like firsthand have this experience where I have that uneasy dread feeling in my gut. And I'm like, whoa, now I feel what my patients are always talking about. And I can always track it back to something sweet that I ate. So it's like, it basically just leaves you in that state that we think just defines us. Like we go through our whole life with that dread, anxious, shaky feeling. We think it's just life is a lot to be anxious about, which it arguably does, but it's actually a physiologic feeling first. And so that's the main reason. And then there's some, like, call them tributary or like side hustle reasons why sugar affects our mood. But one of them is the way it impacts our gut flora. And so I think of sugar as sort of like donating to the wrong campaigns in your gut. It's like, yeah, so like you're voting for Candida, you're voting for pathogenic Clostridium species. You're just voting for the wrong political candidates in your gut. And you're not really voting for like the good guy, probiotic, like beneficial bacteria that don't so much thrive in that environment. And then I think that it also has to do with like, when we're eating shitty food, we are missing our opportunity for eating nutrient-dense food. And I think of nutrition as kind of a scavenger hunt. It's like, yeah, most scavenger hunts are like almost kind of impossible, and this one is too. It's like, they're like, okay, scavenger hunt in Brooklyn. Here's your list of 30 places you have to go see and check the box. And it's like, you only have a few hours. And so I think same thing with nutrition in a day. It's like, you're not going to get everything. But if you generally eat nutrient-dense foods and generally avoid kind of wasted bites, then you're going to do better at the scavenger hunt. And when we're eating sugary foods, it's pretty much a nutritional wasteland, and we're missing our chance to get what we need. And it's not just like to be a virtuous, good, moral, high ground kind of person to eat nutritious food. Like it's literally the building blocks for our neurotransmitters so that our brain can function properly, so we can feel good.
I love that. A client asked me in my Truth with Food group program the other day about, why anxiety, like when you're not eating the right foods, it causes anxiety. And I gave the evolutionary reason, like basically if you're not getting what you just said, the difference between nutrient-dense foods and almost clean eating, which, we didn't talk about clean eating, but I think a lot of times people think those are the same things and they're not. And I love the word nutrient-dense because from an evolutionary standpoint, we used to always eat. Like you wouldn't have had the word nutrient dense because there was nothing else. And so can you define that for people? Nutrient dense versus what we think of as healthy food. I think that's where people get tripped up. Often they think
I love this. Yeah. So nutrient dense, I think about it as like that bite is packed with nutrition, packed with different vitamins and minerals. It checks the various boxes of macronutrients that we need, omega-3s, minerals, these things that we actually just need to function well. And it's not like there's one food that solves all the problems. Like, I mean, if it's anything, it's probably chicken liver pate, but it's basically like Mother Nature's multivitamin. But basically it's that you kind of need to eat like just a variety all the time of, it's basically like, so I have a bee in my bonnet about clean eating, and it's like clean eating. Well, I mean, we could say so very much about like even just the qualitative judgmentiness of the idea of the word clean. But I think that the trouble is that the health food world has really figured out, okay, here's what you take out of the diet. Like drop the gluten and the dairy and the sugar and the canola oil. I'm like, I'm on board with all of that to a certain extent. But then it's like we forget what to add in, and you could eat things that all check the box of that is theoretically Instagram worthy clean food. You just had your green juice and you had your chia seed pudding and you had your matcha latte, like clean. Oh, with oat milk, great. But then you could really be hungry and lacking half of what your body needs and anxious and be totally clean. So it's like, those are wonderful foods, but it's not the whole balanced eating what your great grandmother ate. And so I think that we've just like, as our national eating disorder, like one aspect of that is that we've completely forgotten how to eat enough of a variety of things and how to eat with balance.
Totally. Even like, I think people grew up, like I grew up taking the skin off chicken breast and it's like, I just started putting that on a couple years ago and I'm like, this is delicious. Like, why did I ever think to not eat the skin? I mean, I know why, but like, I think people think like last season we talked about whole foods being on a continuum, right? And I think people think like, to your point, okay, if I'm not eating this, or this, then the rest of my food must be whole foods. But no, there's like throwing parts out, to your point, chicken liver pate, right? Like no one eats organ meats. I actually, the other day at our co-op, they had like some ground meat that had organ meats in it. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is a great approach to getting in, because we'll have like spaghetti squash with sauce and ground meat. And it tasted really good. And I was like, yes, I'm on the path to getting more organ meats, because no one thinks about those, but those are powerhouses.
Yeah, we were taught for so long to get rid of it. I'm not necessarily proud of this, but at this point, I'm like the sneaky person in my family, like eats only the skin. And then I leave all these like just bare chicken parts for the rest of my family to enjoy without skin. But like, who ate all the skin off of the half rotisserie chicken? Oh. But the thing is that, yeah, it's sort of, if you came of age in the 90s and it was like low fat, which in many ways, I think you've pointed this out on previous podcasts, is like the sugar industry kind of did a great marketing PR campaign where they're like pointed at fat and said, that's the problem. And so what happened was we all thought we were being virtuous and doing the right thing, throwing the skin off the chicken, only eating like low fat chicken breast and white meat, and then eating a whole box of Snackwell cookies because those were free, because they were fat free. And it's like there's no fat, so there's no problem with this. And I think that the thing is that we are, thank goodness, and of course we'll learn like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what we're getting wrong in this moment. But at least now we're kind of thinking like real is probably right and fake is probably wrong, which is, I think itself like a very, like, I feel confident in that, at least like in that revolutionary way of looking at food.
Yeah. Even you saying about the word clean and virtuous, like, I think it's hilarious that people are calling them when we are learning how powerful the dirt is, right?
Yeah.
Soil, but yeah, I have a whole philosophical like rant I could go on about that. Yes, but I won't. But yeah.
I get microgreens at my farmer's market, and I'm like, I talk to the farmer and I'm like, I don't wash these because I want your like good organic dirt in my food. And the farmer was like, I would. He basically knows like these chickens are pooping all over it and whatever. But I was like, you're really bursting my bubble here.
So we were talking about chicken skin, but what are some of the like things that you see people are really missing, like, and ideas that you help clients get into those foods into? Because I find that, I mean, I've talked about healthy fats. I feel like I've been talking about them for like 13 years since I've been doing this. And yet I still find sometimes people, I think, are afraid to eat them because of I mean, the idea of cholesterol is caused by fat, not versus instead of sugar or dehydration, like all these things. But I think people are still afraid because of the caloric load, or they find them hard to find. Because if you go out to a restaurant, even some of the quote unquote healthy restaurants, they're using soybean oil or canola oil in their dressing. It's like, so like, what do you tell people to get into to stabilize anxiety? Like what foods, and like, what are some ideas of how they can make that happen?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you like a laundry list of the things that I think still fly under the radar for some people. And then I'm going to totally backpedal and be like, but everyone should be more chill about food. So here's the laundry list, is that I think that, yes, I think at 2020, like we now get that we can eat healthy fats, but I think there probably we require a little bit of an expanded definition of that for some people, because people are like, okay, great, I can eat avocado and olive oil. And it's like, yes, and you can also have grass-fed ghee, and you can also have the chicken skin, and you can also have a fatty cut of beef, as long as it comes from a healthy animal. And I think that segues into another issue, which is that so meat is a whole discussion, and there's so much that goes into that. And when it comes to like an ethical decision or an environmental decision or political or preference or religious, like all of that is sort of sacred and I don't touch it. But if someone's not eating meat for health reasons, I usually want someone to step back and like do an experiment of, what if you incorporated some? Do you feel better? Do you feel different? And I think that we get meat kind of wrong. Like if I have patients who I'm like, okay, try to do an experiment eating a little bit of even, and red meat. Sometimes people need to be like encouraged, not just the like white meatitarians that are like, they eat chicken and they eat fish and they think they're doing the right thing, but like encouraging people to reapproach red meat. And so I have a lot of patients who try that, but then only eat meat in restaurants and then never at home, because they're like, I don't really want to like handle raw meat and cook it. But I think we actually need to flip that, because restaurants, I don't blame them, but like just to get by, to survive in a tough industry, they have to use canola oil. They pretty much have to use concentrated animal feeding operation meat. So they're using this meat that's like ethically abhorrent and not healthy for our bodies, and tastes great and it's cheap. But I think that what you really want to do is pretty much eat vegetarian out in the world and eat as simply as you can in restaurants to try to avoid the inflammatory oils. But then when you're home, that's where you can source really good quality meat. And that's where you can kind of go nuts on eating the whole animal and eating nose to tail and making bone broths and all of this. So those are a couple things on the laundry list. And I think starch is another thing that gets like interpreted incorrectly. And there's certainly people that do well with a keto diet, but I think for most of us who eat carbohydrates, people are always confused, like, are carbs good? Are they bad? But I think that people, like many of us, do well to avoid the processed, refined carbohydrates, like the cookies and cakes and pastries and pastas, but then do great when we're eating starchy vegetables. So sweet potatoes, plantains, taro, yucca, squashes. And I think that like they're a lot more effortful and they're a little bit less of a hit of drugs. But I think that so many of my patients, they start to eat healthier, but then they totally forget about carbohydrates because they picture health being like some kind of lean protein and then vegetables, which I don't know. It was like the early 2000s where like you'd see celebrities being like, my personal chef just makes me fish and steamed vegetables. And like, no. So I always have to like remind people at the sort of troubleshooting check-in sessions, like, are you eating carbohydrate? And so I encourage people to make like a vat of sweet potatoes or mashed potatoes or plantains and have that in the fridge. And then you put a scoop of that on your plate for every meal.
I love that, because that's one of the ways that I've always like learned that I really do need carbohydrates at lunch and dinner. I don't need them at breakfast, but I would feel really anxious and almost like when I don't eat them, it would almost make me feel a little manic. I'm not manic. I don't want to use that term out of context, but it made me so much more like an adrenaline junkie in a way that I am not normally. And it was just kind of like, oh my God, like it was too much like energy. And once I started eating, like I love to do just a sweet potato, like with some ghee and salt. And if I'm feeling really not lazy, I'll add cinnamon on it too. But I'm very lazy when it comes to food. But I find like when I do that, it's like, oh, I get that, like the consistent energy drip in the afternoon, and also helps with sleep rather than that kind of like, oh my God, I'm on fire, like, which can be great for productivity for about an hour. And then you just kind of crash because you're not getting that right combination of starch, fats, and proteins.
Yeah, I see that so often in my practice. I think in particular for women of reproductive age, like carbohydrates, I think of as not so negotiable. And when someone's eliminating carbs altogether, some people really do well with keto, and I do always have to kind of put that caveat in. But for the most part, I'll see women start to get this feeling, it feels like a mania or like an anxiety. They start to have insomnia. They start to have their hair fall out and their periods get irregular and their anxiety is higher, their fatigue is more pronounced, and it's all kind of just solved by like putting a freaking sweet potato in the microwave. It's that easy.
And I loved your idea about plantains. I love plantains, but I think of those as like a vacation food. If I'm going away, they have them, but I think I could make them at home.
Vacation every day at home. Yeah, we eat a lot of plantains in my household, and we're also lazy, but we just saute in coconut oil and then sprinkle cinnamon. Done.
Oh my God, I love it. All right, we are going to take a break from our sponsor, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about sleep and caffeine.
Yeah.
Are you ready to take action from this insatiable season and experience what it's like to be free of sugar cravings? Enter Freedom from Cravings, a 5-week live group coaching program that starts right after Memorial Day. If you've ever wondered why you can eat healthfully but still have a 3 p.m. crash that sends you, even more frequently in our quarantine times, to your cabinet for chips or peanut M&Ms, or why you can be good all day and then overeat popcorn or coconut ice cream while watching Netflix at night, Sugar Rehab will show you how sugar cravings are a biology game, not a willpower or discipline game. Generic advice from magazines or nutrition experts doesn't take into account your unique biology and history. You need to learn where you fall on the vegetarian, Mediterranean, paleo continuum to learn what healthy and good foods are for you. This will help to prevent sugar cravings. No white knuckling required. Rehab programs for other forms of substance abuse focus first on the detox portion to free the body from chemical dependency before delving into the emotional and spiritual reasons for addiction. Likewise, in Freedom from Cravings, we'll focus on the physical and chemical dependency elements of food to clear the way for subsequent work and focus on the deeper-seated issues that may make you turn to food. I'll be personally guiding you through experiences and experiments to determine what your biology needs are to not only prevent sugar cravings all day and at night, but to also feel satiated, focused, optimistic, and energized. Be prepared to be surprised and redefine what healthy means for you and your body. Registration for Freedom from Cravings runs May 18th through May 25th. Save $50 if you register by May 22nd. Enter coupon code EARLYBIRD to save $50. Sign up at AliShapiro.com to get on my list so you don't miss out on the early bird savings or this live program that I only will run once this year. Okay, so we were just talking about starches and everything, and without that, exasperating anxiety. And I want to talk a little bit about caffeine's role in anxiety and also, let's first talk about it. And then I want to ask you a question, because I think sometimes people actually like the role that caffeine plays, but they don't like it. Like the anxiety it creates is almost addictive in a way. And I want to ask you about that. And I think it calls back to our earlier point about trauma, and we can come to expect to be in that state, and that's what's familiar. But I want you to first talk about caffeine's role in anxiety, and then we'll go there.
So smart. Okay, there's so much I want to talk about with this. Yeah, so I think that caffeine, not an inherently bad substance. In fact, coffee, a source of magnesium and antioxidants, and the research, which I think is confounded and worth its own conversation, does show that people who drink more coffee have lower rates of things like type 2 diabetes and Parkinson's disease. It's kind of compelling. But what I think we get wrong is that we're just very variable in how we tolerate caffeine and how we metabolize it. And so, you could be the person that you could have an espresso after dinner and still sleep fine. And so you can just keep doing what you're doing, and lucky you. And then the rest of us, if I had a coffee yesterday, I'd be acting right now as if I was on cocaine. So it just I'm sensitive to it, and I had to grapple with that because I've had a on again, off again, full love affair with coffee throughout my adult life, and I'm off it now, and life does go on. But it's a wonderful, delicious, warming, grounding ritual, and baristas have nice forearms, and the whole thing is it's our favorite thing. But I think our culture right now really romanticizes it, and we have everything we do in American culture, more is better, stronger is better. And like, it's sort of romanticized to drink like strong, dark, black coffee. And like, obviously don't be a softie who puts milk and sugar or whatever, but don't be also. But I think that, but it's like it's now our coffee is so strong and it's so normalized in our culture. And I think we could do well to just recognize, like, for some of us, we're slow metabolizers and we have to opt out of this mainstream culture around coffee. The half-life of caffeine is about 5 to 7 hours for most people. So like, say it's your average and it's 6 hours for you. If you have your one innocent cup of coffee in the morning, you might be doing okay. But if you had like that one more trip to Starbucks at 3 p.m., it's effectively like you're having half a cup of coffee at 9 p.m. And you wouldn't do that, but you're sort of unwittingly doing that. And that makes a lot more sense to us why that would impact the quality of our sleep, because then you have plenty of caffeine buzzing around your brain while you're trying to fall asleep. And it's this really vicious cycle because you're tossing and turning, you're not sleeping well. Then the next day it's like, please put in a, IV drip of caffeine because you didn't get a good night of sleep, and it's sort of so on and so forth each day. And I think that it's just like for people to recognize caffeine does provoke a bit of a stress response. It is one of these root causes of false anxiety. It makes your nervous system kind of ready for a fight. And if you introduce a stressor, which in modern life is not in short supply, like say you are standing on the subway or you get an uncomfortable email from your boss when you arrive at work or whatever it is, like the coffee just makes your nervous system just sort of like really chomping at the bit and ready to fight. Whereas if you weren't amped up on caffeine, you might have been able to be a little less reactive, take a deep breath, kind of go with the flow of what comes at you in a day. And I think you alluded to something, which I want to hear your perspective on this, but I think like with trauma, with the fact that we're kind of a familiar home base is to be hypervigilant and with our nervous system in a state of arousal, caffeine kind of provides that comfortable, familiar feeling. And then I also think maybe this is shifting right now with COVID-19, but we're also in a culture that just like only values our productivity and our go-go-go-ness, and rest, like which should be the other half of the yin yang, like that is looked at as lazy or slothful and shouldn't take up any part of your day, let alone half of your day. So we use coffee to kind of feel like Super Mario that just got the mushroom. It's just like we like to feel that amped up feeling of like, I'm on. And on is fine, but on should be 50% of life and not 99%.
Yeah. What I've noticed, because I often have clients come to me, with, I want to get off sugar, blah, blah, blah. And then what they start to realize once we go through the process is that they actually, the spiraling, and, often it comes off as thinking about food, spiraling about food. But in our work, we get to like, well, that's just the symptom. But what I found is that people who have had a lot of trauma, and again, little t, micro traumas, I think, as you've called them, not necessarily war or refuge. I mean, most people who listen to the podcast know we define trauma differently, but just in case someone's just listening to this episode. But what I found is that, often this spiraling that caffeine can do, or even sugar, this anxiety, it's the way they're defining being on, and the identity they're protecting is overcompensating for the trauma that they had as a child. So, for example, if a client grew up in a house where there was a lot of chaos from hoarding or divorce or whatever, they're almost hyper over-indexing on organization and productivity, and I need a list. And it's like, because they are afraid of that, like do you know what I mean? Like it's like almost in reaction to running away from that kind of chaos, but they've created the same sort of chaos, but it's a more noble, societally accepted chaos. Right.
Yeah, there's something like obliquely related to this, which I found so revolutionary when I first learned about it. There's a book by Gabor Mate called Scattered. And it's about like if you grow up with chaos or trauma in your home, it's sort of like a way that you cope is to escape, and that can look in adulthood like ADHD. And it's almost like you just learn to like not be present and not be there, not be in the moment because it was too uncomfortable and overwhelming to sort of be with it. And I think that coffee, in a way, people are often using it to sort of like pull themselves back into focus. But sometimes it is just working with the trauma in the first place so that you can be in the present moment just as you are, just a flawed human who isn't on steroids. And that can sometimes, the work is actually in just how to get comfortable with the normal, with stillness, with just being ourselves with our feelings in the moment.
I love that you say that is getting comfortable with stillness, because I think so much of like wellness advertising, I always talk about this with clients or my group programs, but it's like all of the wellness advertising is very quote unquote clean and minimal. And I'm like, what they want you to do is think that you're going to have like internal space, right? Like it looks like it's this external environment of like the woman sipping tea near the mountains, right? But it's like, even if you were to go up and do that, if you don't resolve inner trauma or even get your blood sugar right, you can be in that mountain sipping tea and you're still going to be like, flipping through your phone, right? Like worried about things, but it's like, oh my God, the people doing wellness, hardcore wellness marketing know what they're doing, right? It's like,
wow. Oh, I love that. I've never thought about like the way that that's part of what they're trying to convey with that imaging. And I think you're exactly right. And in a way, part of what the wellness industry is selling us is actually like clutter and crap. And so it's like, not only do we not live on the mountaintop, we live in our tiny studio apartments, but now it's got like a pile in the corner of like various gear for our wellness practices. It's like a supplement wasteland over here. And then that weird, and like, don't get me wrong, like I own a lot of this crap. Like I have an infrared sauna sleeping bag, and now I even have an earthing sheet on my bed. Like I do buy into the crap, but I think that so much of the time what we just need is less. And like I think that you just always have to look like if someone's selling you something, and the wellness industry is absolutely selling us something. And self-care is not buying something. It is just like doing less, saying no, putting things out of your calendar, and just showing up to yourself with like giving yourself rest and space and getting really acquainted with what it means to be in stillness and in silence with ourselves.
Yeah, I love that you brought up that earthing thing. We were walking through the park the other day, and it had just rained and we all got muddy, and I'm like, we're earthing.
There's a speckle of mud on your calf count.
Trusting stillness and space is so challenging. Again, even if you haven't had past trauma, just to your point, like the productivity that gets rewarded, and like the honor of being so busy, right? Or not the honor, but like it's fun to be like, I'm so busy, because it's like, we think that means someone's hardworking and all those things that go along with that. So how do you suggest people get off caffeine? Because one of the things that I am like you, like I love coffee, but I can't tolerate it. And sometimes like I made it 6 weeks postpartum, and then I started drinking it again. And I've recently tapered down to black tea. And now I'm going to, when there's no longer black tea, I'm going to switch to green tea. But one of the things that was really fascinating to me is like, you are so tired in the morning. People think they need caffeine because they're tired, but I've read that it's actually the withdrawal from the caffeine. And I was like, oh, motherfucker. It's like,
it's how they get you. Every successful industry ever like creates something that has a withdrawal, so it's like, whether it's alcohol or Starbucks or video games or sugar industry, it's like, that's how they hook us in, is that you go into withdrawal. It's like, okay, I will go back to that product. And you don't even think to blame the product. You just think, coffee, you're my best friend. You just made my headache go away. And it's like, actually you made my headache. And then you made my headache go away. But yeah, I think
what's the logical term for that when like you like praise your captor? Is that like
well, yeah, there is what do you call that? Whoa, what, neither of us can think of that right now.
Oh wow. But
the syndrome, it's like a German term.
Yeah.
Okay, anyway.
You get the point, listeners.
We need our assistant here to Google that for us. Stockholm Syndrome. Okay. I tasked my 4-year-old. No, I didn't. So, yeah, I think that in a way, I actually don't even think it is Stockholm Syndrome, although maybe that's what Stockholm Syndrome is actually just that your captor like feeds you and is like helping you with all your various withdrawals. But I think that like getting off of coffee, getting off of caffeine in general, the key is just gradual, and don't make any calls on like, how did this go, until you're really fully off and you have a little time off. So I think that I go extremely gradually. Like if I went back on coffee when I spent 7 months traveling around the world, and the coffee is just better and my body tolerates it better in other parts of the world. Go figure. Whole other conversation. And so like I was drinking my cappuccinos in Italy, and even in New Zealand, it was good. And, then I would get back to American soil, and suddenly coffee would again make me feel like I was on cocaine. And so I took about 2 months to go from a cup a day of coffee down to nothing. And it's like a taper. And I go from, if say you're someone who's drinking a couple cups of coffee a day, then you might make the latest one in the day your half calf. And then you just keep chipping away at it till you're down to one, and then that's half calf. And then once you're down like half calf, you can tolerate that. Then you go to black tea, and maybe you have a couple black teas as an equivalent for a cup of coffee. And then you would just keep weaning off the black tea, get down to green tea. And then even a cup of green tea, like I was weaning off of that gradually, because otherwise I was irritable. I had a headache. I was not a happy camper. And so I go really, really gradually. And at the end, when you're finally off, it's lousy for a little while. And you have to just kind of be okay with that and do it over a weekend, kind of upfront communicate with the people around you that you're going to be a little bit sucky for a few days and get through it, maybe CBD oil to help with the headache. And then once you're off, like fully off, and a few days have passed, you actually really recenter back to who you were, but your energy is more even and your sleep is better and you no longer interrupt people in the same annoying way. So it's like really kind of nice. And I think it's important to trust that like you can function without caffeine. It just is a process getting there. And that's just it. When you wake up and you think all that can get me out of bed and all that could feel good in the world right now is coffee, it's just that you are in massive caffeine withdrawal. And the best feeling in the world is the antidote to withdrawal.
Oh, yeah. I love that. That's so helpful. Because again, I think sometimes when we are feeling anxious or our blood sugar is all crazy, we just think in all or nothing, right? It's like stress response or nothing. And so to have like a moderate middle of how to get off of it. I am curious though, what do you think is added to American coffee that makes it harder for you and probably a lot of us?
I guess to me, where my thinking has arrived at with this is that Roundup is a big factor. And maybe it's not even just Roundup. Like, I don't know if they spray Roundup on coffee beans, but I think at this point, our municipal water, for the most part, has Roundup residue in it. So like the coffee has Roundup one way or another. And I don't know, I think that like for me, I've done this experiment around gluten so much. And I think you and I have this in common with like a family history of celiac. And I was never diagnosed with celiac, but like I was well on my way to getting celiac, I'm convinced, but I just got off gluten and felt a lot better. But for me, I eat gluten when I'm international. Like if I'm in Italy or if I'm in, Asia, I tolerate the gluten, absolutely no problem. And it's a lot of fun. And then as soon as I touch down on American soil, I don't tolerate it again. And I've kind of done the experimentation around, is it just the vacation mindset because you're relaxed? But I was in Hawaii and that was a vacation mindset and I was relaxed. It was paradise, but the gluten affected me badly. The coffee affected me badly. So there's something in American soil, American municipal water. There's probably some synergistic effect of various chemicals in our agriculture that for me makes me not tolerate all these wonderful delights of life.
I think you're right. Ugh, it's kind of scary when if you think too hard about it.
It's not great, but I think that to me, it's not an accident to just sort of like be living here in this moment, in this twisted world. Like, I think it's for a purpose.
Oh, I love that. We can choose to make it for one, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So one last question. I can't thank you enough for breaking all of this down, but I had talked about in the intro here, sometimes a lot of people who listen to this podcast are also practicing intuitive eating and trying to arrive at that. And there's a lot I love about intuitive eating, and I often don't think it goes far enough. And when we talk about processed foods and anxiety, again, often what I've seen with clients when they're eating processed foods and trying to follow the intuitive eating, advice is they're anxious because they're not eating the right foods for themselves. Then they, choose something and then they're like, I'm still not satisfied. And the intuitive eating advice is like, well, eat it. And then I find that for at least my clients, maybe they're more sensitive, I don't know, that deregulates them further. And so can you talk a little bit about how to start to, again, we've talked about adding fats and starches, meats if people need to, but how that how you navigate that with your clients and patients, I guess I should say, about the disordered eating. Because I think most of America has it, disordered eating. I don't think it's just people individually. I think it's collectively we learn. So what is your thought on that as we start to try to, eliminate these processed sugary carbs, including pretzels and, crackers, to get nutrient dense foods in?
Yeah. So, I think it's in certain ways, I've certainly had a lot of experience working on this with patients, but I think what's the truest is probably just to say my own experience with this, which was that when I was in med school, I got really out of balance with my eating. And I remember I went to like a CBT therapist and she was like, okay, 3 square meals, 2 snacks, nothing's off limits, eat everything. And that helped me to an extent, get back into a balanced pattern of eating, but nothing off limits was actually wrong for me. And that's certainly the eating disorder orthodoxy. But I think people who have gut dysfunction and maybe err on the side of autoimmune proneness and basically don't tolerate certain foods, I think that in a way, those foods were behaving like drugs for me. And like the drug-like culprit foods are things like, for some people gluten, for some people dairy, for some people sugar, and then sometimes just these like flavor crystals that are added to processed foods. And for me, like that was why my eating was getting disorderly, was that food was behaving like a drug in my body. And it created a deprivation binge cycle. It created this like out of control feeling because I really couldn't stop. Like the Pringles slogan, like you can't eat just one. It's like, I couldn't. It's like, it's not fair. Yeah. They're like, listen, we put in plain sight that we made this shit addictive. And so like, it's a drug in my body. And like the idea that nothing was off limits and just to eat it in moderation was driving me completely out of my mind. And what I learned inefficiently eventually is that what I had to do was actually abstain from the drug-like foods. I basically took a page out of like alcohol sobriety. It's like abstinence. Like you can't have just one glass of wine if this is going to send you off to the races. I couldn't have one Milano cookie or whatever it was. I couldn't have one bite of a sandwich, honestly. Like even the gluten was triggering me. So I had to abstain from the foods that were really behaving like drugs in my body, not forever, but for a while, so that I really reset my relationship to those foods and also healed my gut. And then I got to a place in life where I was so much more fulfilled in general and not like having a hole that I needed to fill with drugs, but also got to a place where I had just like reset these food relationships. So I could come back to a Milano cookie and be like, hey, that tastes good, but I'm not going to go on a binge. And I think for my patients, but certainly for myself, like a period of abstinence has sometimes been important, and from the drug-like foods. And then what you do is what you eat instead are the real foods. And intuitive eating, I think, to me is my favorite compass with eating. And it's basically, well, what is your body saying it wants right now? Okay, can we discern whether it's telling us a need that it has or a drug craving? Like if your body's like, okay, what I feel like right now is a juicy, dripping steak, or what I need right now is a piece of salmon and some greens, or what I need right now is a vat of plantains. Like to me, those are all your body communicating what you actually need. And if your body's like, yes, my wisdom tells me I need a pizza, like I think that that's a drug-like craving. And I think that the discernment is really just, is this a drug craving or is this a need? And if it's a need, you honor it. And I think that with all these things, you can't make an early call because there's sometimes a lot of nutritional debt to repay, and you kind of have to like build for a while until you're really repleted. And only then can you say like, okay, like this is really working. When I eat what my body tells me it needs, my body functions well and I feel good. And once you've gotten into that peaceful relationship with your body and with your yearnings, like it's also just like you've gone through couples therapy with your body at that point. Like it's a peaceful, harmonious relationship.
I love that. And that your word discernment, I was working with talking with a client last week and she's like, why isn't everybody talking about discernment? And I'm like, because it's not a sexy word, but it's like, I mean, that's what I do with clients. It's like, is it like to your point, is it like a need, like a nutritional need? And that's where, I mean, I work on the story level of like when people are turning to that thing, the food, when it's a drug-like craving. I love your framing of that. It's like, okay, it's probably not about the food. And I think that's sometimes where intuitive eating thinks that, not that, they'll be like, well, if you're lonely, and call someone, but I'm looking at like, what's the story and the patterns and behaviors of how you're actually isolating yourself, because calling your friend, that's not why you're turning to this, not because you haven't called your friend. You know what I mean? Like it's, it's not really the root cause. It's a pattern of isolation and loneliness and whatnot. But I think that word discernment is so important, and really kind of doing a diagnostic check of like, okay, what is this really about? And sometimes that's what's so tricky. Sometimes it is really about lacking nutrition, like nutrient density. To your point, you have to like really feed yourself nutrient-rich foods for a while to almost unnormalize the normal feelings of anxiety and cravings. And last season, I just said to people, I'm all about intuitive eating, and why can't we hear our intuition? And I think processed foods are designed to interfere with that.
I even think, like, I love the name of this podcast, like Insatiable, because I mean, I love that on so many levels, just like an insatiable lust for life and learning
Yes.
and everything. But I also think that, like, one for me, what was the greatest feeling was to learn satiety. And because I felt like what I really struggled with was overeating. I was like, I see other people getting full and stopping it. I cannot. I will keep eating forever. And I think that with nutrient density, like I think when the body knows it doesn't have the nutrition it needs, there's a little bit of a signal that's just like, just keep eating. Maybe at some point this like tasty delight bucket will get us what we need, and it won't. But it kind of just thinks like, keep going until you get what you need. And so I think once you start actually repleting nutrition and giving your body what it really needs to function, and it doesn't need to like escape into a drug like binge, like that's not meeting the need. It needs nutrition, but all it knows to do is tell you to eat, and all you know to do is feed it the foods around you. And I think that once you actually feed it the good food, it starts to think, I have enough. Okay, you can feel full. And for me, I never really felt that until I got off the drugs of food and got onto food that was actually nourishing my body. And then I experienced satiety. And that was like such a freeing feeling. And I, to this day, like as someone who was so chronically overeating and so chronically constipated, I'm like now, like any poop and any experience of satiety, I'm just like, hallelujah, it's like a good thing. But I think that that's it, is that like satiety is also the freedom on the other side of the coin of like, you know, when you're hungry and when you're like getting to really enjoy that food and delicious food and sharing a meal with someone, like these are the joys of being alive in a body. And I enjoy it all the more also knowing that my body will tell me when I've had enough.
Yeah, I love that word. And I think that satiety is almost the anecdote of anxiety, both physiologically and psychologically, right?
Ooh.
That's the level I operate on. Like, let's look at the metaphor here. And that's what, in our stories, we cut ourselves off from emotional satiety, which is part of that binge restrict cycle, which is why I love working on that level, because people start to discover, oh, I don't love food as much as I think I do. It's meeting some sort of unmet needs on a emotional level. But I love that. I think that's just such a nugget people can take away of satiety, with food will help reduce anxiety physiologically, because it isn't all in your head. It's in your body too, right?
God, I love that so much. And emotional satiety, I just think about like these two major phases of life and how we need it. And it's like in infancy and in childhood, we need this kind of like caretaker, safety, feeling loved and feeling, in a good enough way, just feeling seen and delighted in. And like that is our emotional satiety in early life. And then as adults, and I think so many problems happen when we don't really get that need met in childhood. And then as adults, I think like we're really misfiring and like missing the ways we need emotional satiety, which is like, I think kind of Freud put this well, but like we need meaningful work. We do need meaningful relationships. And like, I actually think we need meaning. Like, I think most of us do when we have some degree of a spiritual connection, which can be very broad. Like, it doesn't have to be like, oh, I believe in God. It can be anything, but it can be, I believe in like how fucking awesome nature is. But I think that it's like those kinds of meanings, I think, are what help us feel fulfilled and okay and safe as adults.
100%. And, going back to, we'll kind of conclude with when you talked about at the kickoff of, false and real anxiety, I find that bridge of healing trauma often creates meaning, and we have the power to choose the meaning when we own our story. And that is like medicine that you don't know, you don't need until, like, you never knew it was missing or that you needed it until you have it. So yeah, I love the concept of meaning and it just makes us feel safer, right? Whether the world is safe or not, it makes us feel safe. And who's to say if the world is safe or not? Now we're getting trippy, but I mean, it certainly is dangerous at times, and it's also safe, right? It's holding for all of it.
Well, I think like even when we're not okay, there is a place to like, there's an intact okayness that we can access. And I think like the world, like shit does happen, but that's not a reason to live in fear. It's to recognize how empowered we are to nimbly, creatively adjust to when shit happens, and just to recognize like we are strong and we write this story.
Yeah, totally. Dr. Vora, thank you so much for being here. Is there anything that you want to add that I didn't ask you?
I think we covered a lot of ground and we have 10 more podcasts in us.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And where can people find more of you? I mean, we'll link to you in the show notes, but where can people find you online?
Yeah, I'm most active on Instagram. I'm at EllenVoraMD. And then I have a website, ellenvora.com, which sort of has everything there in one place. And yeah, Allie, thank you so much.